Hi, and welcome to week 15, which is on Romanesque and Gothic art of the Middle Ages. Part 1 concerns Romanesque art and architecture. This week combines chapter 16 on Romanesque art and 17 on Gothic art. While both chapters are fairly thorough, I feel that for this class it'd be better to combine our discussions of the two styles. This also leaves us then with next week to spend on chapter 18 on 14th century art in Europe, which transitions to the content of Art 282 and seems to be a nice way to wind down the course. Combining chapters 16 and 17 will necessitate cutting down our coverage of some material. Our focus will be on French architecture, and in discussions of other art forms we'll venture sometimes out of France. On the exam, you'll not be responsible for artwork in chapters 16 and 17 that is not covered in the week's lecture. Let's talk about Romanesque period culture. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, our first stop is in this Romanesque period, dating from 1000 to about 1150 CE. The Romanesque era is so called for the art and architecture of the time, which is perceived by later art historians and critics as Roman-like. Compared to art and architecture of the early Middle Ages and Byzantine eras, architecture resembled Roman models. There was a perceptible focus on Roman elements like the round arch, columns, and capitals, and perhaps most importantly, monumental figural sculpture, which, after all, had been missing from art since ancient Roman times. The agricultural servant economy that marked the early Middle Ages continues into the Romanesque era. Wealthy landed nobility, meaning that they owned land, maintained their reciprocal allegiance to the Pope through relationships with vassals. Loyal military men who pledged allegiance to their lord in exchange for control over land. This relationship between lord and vassal is commonly known as fealty. Local monasteries, which we will frequently call abbeys, continued to provide and receive support from these feudal lords, who granted the monasteries land. Local abbots and abbesses were usually relatives of the landed nobility, thus reinforcing the connection between rulership and the church. As such, rule continues to be relatively local and small in scale, the scale of the system reinforced by the benefit to individuals, such as vassals, who might become title holders as counts or dukes. Despite this continued emphasis on small-scale rules, eventually, during the Romanesque period, many groups of cities begin to unify into nations. An important event of the Romanesque period is the first of 4 Christian crusades against Islam. The main goal of the crusades, as stated by Urban II, was to conquer and reclaim the Holy Land of Jerusalem for Christianity. The motivations and purposes behind these crusades are up for historical debate. During the Fourth Crusade, for example, which takes place during the Gothic period, the campaign ran out of money, and so the goal switched to the sacking of the Orthodox Christian kingdom of Byzantium. But one of the major positive cultural effects of the Crusades for Western Europe was its contact with the generally more sophisticated and cosmopolitan East of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. It's largely believed that despite its initially hostile nature, this contact between East and West made possible the elegant and refined art of the later Middle Ages. As the Romanesque period wears on, people continued to move toward the cities. In part, this was due to increased trade made possible by the new connections forged through the Crusades. Universities sprung up in large cities, especially Paris, Bologna in Italy, and Cambridge and Oxford in England. During the Romanesque period, knowledge from the Greco-Roman world, which was sometimes dismissed or vilified as pagan, was beginning to be reincorporated into Western thought. Yet while some moved to the cities to learn, others found an excellent education in the monasteries. Though monasteries were still associated with service to the poor and humble, the lack of a line between secular and religious power benefited them economically. Since monasteries were, in the Romanesque period, more frequently associated with or even run by local aristocrats or their friends, their wealth was largely guaranteed. Local elites, children and relatives of lords and vassals, would study at monasteries. This ensured funds would be available for the number of large abbey church and monastery projects that we'll read about in this chapter. It also ensured funds to hire artists to make reliquaries and other items made popular through the emergence of pilgrimage culture. Monastic culture of the early Middle Ages developed into a so-called pilgrimage culture of sacred sites during the Romanesque period. While many European pilgrims desired to go to Jerusalem, there were many sites in Western Europe for pilgrims to visit. Four main routes through Spain and France led thousands of pilgrims per year on foot to important Christian sites. Many of these sites were abbeys with relics of famous saints and martyrs. The tomb of St. Peter in Rome, the bones of Lazarus in Autun in France, and the robe of Mary in Chartres in France were among the most visited relics. One of the most vividly decorated Romanesque examples of reliquaries is that of Sainte Foy, or Saint Faith, a child martyr. There is a section that describes the holy theft of this relic in your book. Saint Foy's reliquary is extraordinarily preserved, but at the same time rather unusual. The gold leaf and jewels that adorn it are meant to impart the idea of holiness, much like the book covers of the early Middle Ages. Eventually, the Catholic Church deemed that all churches and cathedrals should have relics, and viewing these relics was an important goal of the Romanesque pilgrims. Ultimately, the four main routes led through France into Spain, culminating in the last stop, Santiago de Compostela, which is the Cathedral of St. James. In these images, you can see how the four routes end up converging down at Puerta de la Reina and end up in Santiago de Compostela. And these are many sites that we're going to be stopping at along the way in the next couple of chapters. You'll be able to see 3 images of Santiago de Compostela in the lecture online. I have a few of them for you too, including this exterior drawing, and then a plan, floor plan, and then an interior photo, which you can see here pretty well. These images demonstrate some of the ways that architecture is changing in the Romanesque period to accommodate pilgrimage culture. In the reconstruction drawing, which you can see here, it's necessary to have a reconstruction drawing instead of a photo because of the large number of changes in the structure since the Romanesque period. But it shows us the church from the back. We're seeing the apse, the place for the altar, and its radiating chapels. Radiating chapels are new to the period. They provide extra space and serve as little secondary apses upon the main apse. You can see how well they expand the space by looking at the drawing. See how much extra space there is in there. These chapels provide space to display sacred objects that worshipers would like to see, as well as extra room for more people. The chapels can be accessed by a semicircular ambulatory, which you're seeing here, this walkway, so that visitors won't cross through the holiest part of the church, the sanctuary, where the altar resides. So this way, they walk around it. Something else that you can see in the reconstruction drawing is the lantern tower. The lantern tower, which is right here, tops the crossing, which is the space where the nave, remember, which is the long central aisle, and the transept meet. That is the crossing. And above it is a lantern tower. With the relatively few number of windows in Romanesque-style churches, lantern towers are enormously helpful. You can see the amount of light that they let in from this photo of the nave of Santiago de Compostela. You can also see a really complex lantern. Let's see if I can find it at Saint-Sernin. There's one there in the Church of Conques Abbey. And then there's also one, there you are, at Saint-Sernin in Toulouse. You can see this is a really tall lantern tower with lots and lots of windows. Other popular Romanesque architectural features appear in the Santiago de Compostela nave photo. The nave and aisles, as well as transepts, are widening. The round arches that separate the nave from the side aisles, which you can see here, side aisles here and nave here, and the arches that separate them, spring from what we call compound piers. So you see each of these arches, the springing of them is from not just a simple column or a simple square support, but a pier that actually looks like several, I guess you could say several columns or colonnettes squished together. And this is what we mean by compound. It's many kind of placed together. The barrel vaulted ceiling, which you can see here, is supported by what we call transverse arches. There's one there, there's one there, there's one implied here, and actually all through the nave we could see transverse arches going from one side of the nave to another above us. Arches that are perpendicular to the projection of the barrel vault are called transverse. That is, they cross the nave or they cross the vault. And it's hard to see, but the aisles along either side of the nave are covered in groin vaults, basically, which are two barrel vaults intersecting each other. These same effects can be seen in the nave photo of the Abbey Church of Isenc. You can see here some transverse arches. You can see a compound pier here, although not as elaborate at Santiago de Compostela. You can see it here at Cluny, transverse arches, compound piers, very large, heavy compound piers. And then compound piers, that is not just a single column, but like many columns compounded together, and then transverse arches across the nave. And since we were looking at Santiago de Compostela from the back, it's easy to miss the prominent towers flanking the entry of this church, as well as another great example which we want to look at, which is actually the Abbey Church of Conques, which you can see here. And here you can see again from the back, so we don't maybe necessarily notice these towers right at first. So the treatment of the facade this way with two towers in the front or facade is based on the development of the westwork that we saw during the Carolingian and Attonian periods in the last week. The effect of the towers is easier to see in this eastern view of Conques, and then I think I have one from or western view, and then I have one from Saint Etienne. There we go. So Saint Etienne or Saint Stephen in Caen, you can see the facade. We're viewing it from the quote-unquote front or the facade, so it's much easier to see how tall and prominent the towers are. So now the westwork, where once the towers were sort of more incorporated into the body of the face or facade, are now extending up above it, even though of course the very sort of last spires are much later. Saint Etienne was built as a Benedictine monastery church. The nave photo here, as well as this drawing, demonstrate the remarkable Romanesque interior. Saint Etienne's nave is not a barrel vault, as we would typically find, and we have been finding in our Romanesque churches that we've been looking at. Instead, we're actually seeing the first known use of what is known as rib vaulting. This is a form of masonry vaulting that will become more common in the Gothic period. In rib vaulting, the arches are no longer transverse or just crossing the nave, but diagonal. You can see this diagonal cross here and there and there and there all the way down. And what happens then is it forms a web of ribs. Rib vaulting, we'll see, allows for taller naves. And then this drawing of Saint Etienne invites a comparison between the rib vaulting here and the original timber roof, which had burned. As with any international style, Romanesque architecture took on variations. One variation, sometimes called Cistercian Romanesque, promoted a somewhat more austere aesthetic. The Cistercian order criticized other monastic orders, especially the Benedictines, for moving away from what they felt was a properly ascetic approach to monasticism. This attitude extends to the lavishness with which objects such as relics and the abbey churches themselves were decorated. The Cistercian style of the Abbey Church of Notre Dame in Fontenay, seen here, bears out this attitude. A plan of the Fontenay complex can be seen here and in your book, and it demonstrates the practical approach of Cistercian Romanesque architects. Everything fits at right angles, in a way that allows for easy expansion if necessary. Chapels and apse are actually squared off rather than rounded, which is really unusual. The facade and interior of the church, the facade you can see here, and the interior you can see here, and this is a little better there, display the lack of elaborate ornamentation. A simplified engaged column or attached column decorates the compound piers, and that's really just about it for decoration. There's no upper gallery of decoration or windows, no clerestory. Right. The vault is lined with transverse arches that actually happen to be pointed. While we don't see as many pointed arches in the Romanesque, we will in the Gothic era. They are popular in this French region in particular. The cathedral complex at Pisa in Italy also represents a variation of Romanesque style. Italian cities' connections to the ancient Roman world affected the Italian form of the Romanesque style. The interior of San Clemente, which you can see here, actually reuses ancient Roman columns and capitals. Meanwhile, the shape of the Pisa Cathedral, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, resembles actually the Basilica of Old St. Peter's back from week 7 and 8, which is the first major church of Christendom and the seat of the Catholic Church. The exterior is decorated with beautiful marble and colored stones and arches and pilasters. You can see these pilasters and arches. A pilaster is a small supportive column that doesn't really provide a ton of support. And that especially reminds the viewer of Roman-style elements. The complex is typically Italian in that it has a separate baptistry, which is the round building here, and a campanile or bell tower. The campanile of Pisa is especially famous for its sinking foundation, and it's known, as I'm sure you realize, as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Your book aptly refers to Romanesque churches as speaking, for their facades, which were once blank, started to become filled with imagery of a mystic and narrative nature. The use of monumental sculpture, especially in architectural decoration, is one of the reasons that this style is called Romanesque. Once blank walls and doorways were filled with sculpture in the tympanum, the lunette-shaped space above the doorway. Which you can see here, this is the tympanum. Actually, maybe this illustration would be a little better. You can see that in the tympanum, in the place known as the trumo, right, which is the space in between the doors and the column filling that space, as well as the capitals of columns and other architectural spaces. Imagery include New Testament events, Old Testament figures, later martyrs and saints, and decorative elements. Occasionally, contemporary figures were included in sculpture programs. One of the first good examples comes from the Priory Church of St. Pierre in Moissac. The south portal of St. Pierre is an especially well-preserved version of the Christ in Majesty theme. The motif had been popular in paintings and mosaics of early Christian and Byzantine churches. It was popular in tympana of churches and portals during the Romanesque period. The Priory Church was an important stop on a pilgrimage route, and the south portal allows easy and quiet entry off the transept instead of through the main western entrance. The image of Christ transfigured. Let's see if we can find a close-up of him. Hold on a sec. Here we go. We can see him a little better now. The image of Christ transfigured is actually quite stylized, with elongated figure in the center, filling a mandorla. You may recognize the winged figures around him as the symbols of the four evangelists. We have seen them before in illuminated manuscripts. You can read your textbook's fascinating interpretation of the visual impact of the portal. In the trumo of the portal, in particular, is an excellent example of Romanesque sculptural innovation. A prophet appears in high relief, elongated and posed so as to properly fill the scalloped column-like space. See that here, a little bit better in situ there. The Romanesque integration of architecture and sculpture could not be better represented than by this trumo. Another theme that was enormously popular for portal tympanum was the Last Judgment. A Last Judgment typically depicts Christ as judge, as the dead rise from their graves, and in some way illustrates the division of the righteous from the damned. Perhaps the theme is most at home decorating the portal tympanum at the Church of Saint Lazare in Autun. For Saint Lazare is none other than Saint Lazarus, whom Christ is believed to have raised from the dead. Autun's portal, like at Saint Pierre, depicts a stoic, elongated, and stylized Christ within a mandorla. The neatly arranged, symmetrical composition makes clear the fact that one afterlife or another is waiting for each person, and that his or her actions will determine where he or she goes. This close-up, see if I can find a close-up of the more whimsical element. I can't, but I can point it out to you here. A little bit more whimsical element there, as demon-like figures weigh souls on a set of scales. You can read a little bit more about this tympanum in a closer look in your book. Yet another cautionary image reminding the viewer of sin can be found in the many versions of the fall of man, as the temptation in the Garden of Eden is often called. In Villegelmo's Creation and Fall, from Modena, Italy, the lively figures are reminiscent of the figures in the Autun tympanum. Yet in this panel, the space they occupy is organized with columns and arches in a way that reminds the textbook author of ancient Roman sarcophagi. This is not surprising, as we have seen that Italian Romanesque examples seem to draw more frequently from ancient Roman models than French Romanesque art or architecture. The capital with Eve, which you can see here from Saint Lazare at Autun, is one of a pair depicting the fall. These historiated capitals, as they're called, were also filled with lively figures in settings that are remarkably decorative. As in the early Middle Ages, illuminated manuscripts continued to play an important role in the intellectual and spiritual spheres of the Romanesque period, and for the most part they continued to be made by monks and nuns, though some non-cloistered workshops were beginning to appear. St. Matthew, from the Codex Coburtinus, opens the Gospel in a way that is quite unlike our Hiberno-Saxon examples from last week. Instead of being surrounded by interlacing elements or inlay-like decoration, the figure of Matthew is in an architectural setting. The letter L beside him is decorated in a way that reminds the viewer of the decorative elements of the priory church of Saint-Pierre-Moissac. Indeed, this was actually made in Moissac. The portrait of the nun Guda from her Book of Homilies, which she wrote and illuminated, also presents a more Romanesque-style approach to historiated initials, in which the formally complex intricacies of Hiberno-Saxon decoration are transformed into a style more interested in shape and blocks of color. Women frequently wrote and illuminated books. Indeed, being a nun was one way in which a woman could learn to read and write and create art. Hildegard of Bingen, who famously wrote and illuminated her visions in the Liber Civius, is featured in an inset in your book. While few examples remain, we know that fiber art forms continued too to play an important role during the later Middle Ages. Probably the best preserved and most famous surviving example of Romanesque fiber art is the needlework piece known as the Bayeux embroidery. For centuries erroneously but affectionately known as the Bayeux tapestry. The Bayeux embroidery is a long piece of needlework, with images crafted entirely in stitches of thread. The piece is a document telling the compelling narrative of the ascension of William the Conqueror of Normandy to the throne of England in 1066. It famously includes the image of a cosmic event now known to be the appearance of Halley's Comet. The Bayeux embroidery was made either in Normandy in France or in England. You can read about and see more details of this work in your book.